This is Dateline News and Conversation. My guest tonight is Peter Kuznick. He's a professor of history and the director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. He and Oliver Stone co-authored The Untold History of the United States and a 10-part Showtime documentary film. It was a series based on the book. Peter regularly provides commentary for all the major U.S. and international media, and he has begun his fourth three-year term as Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer. I first met Peter and interviewed him at American University in 2011, I think it was. Peter introduced me to Oliver Stone, who graciously allowed me to interview him for my documentary, The Ghost of Jeju. I'm very happy to welcome Peter Kuznick. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Regis. It's good to be on with you again.
You bet. There's a lot to talk about tonight, Peter, and I think one of the most important things for people in my part of the world, which is the Russian Federation, was the conference in Istanbul this past week. What are your thoughts on what led up to that? What resulted from that?
There's a lot of external pressure on both Putin and Zelensky to resolve this conflict, this war, as quickly as possible. However, there is not a lot of internal pressure on either one yet. And I think that they were checking off boxes. In terms of Putin's decision to meet, he has been saying he wanted to talk to the Ukrainians for quite some time now. And the Ukrainians have put up their own preconditions, ceasefire, complete ceasefire. They've put it into their constitution that they can't negotiate with Putin. This has been there for a long time. I mean, the Russians have also made it difficult. Putin's been saying that Zelensky is an illegitimate leader, that he is now an unelected leader because he's canceled the elections because of the martial law that's going on. So they've put up a lot of roadblocks. But the reality is that Russia sees advantage to not negotiating at this point. Russia is on the offensive militarily. Ukraine is outmanned, outgunned, outmaneuvered. And so the longer that this goes on, Putin apparently thinks the more of Ukraine that Russia will control, the stronger position they'll be in at the bargaining table, and the more that they're going to gain. And I listened just earlier today, I was watching CNN to see if there was any update yet on the phone call that's going on right now between Trump and Putin. And I hear the CNN announcer from Kyiv calling this an unprovoked Russian invasion. Well, whatever you're going to say about it, it was highly provoked. And Americans should realize that. I mean, one of the myths that the Americans are focusing on, one is the idea that this was unprovoked, that it's a sign of Putin's desire to reestablish the Russian Empire of some sort, or at least the Soviet Union. Number one. Number two, the idea that Ukraine can militarily win back what Russia has gained. They're both false. And the number three is that if Putin is able to win in Ukraine, then he's going to start gobbling up one piece of Europe after another. That fear mongering is at the root of something that I see that is very unfortunate. And that's not only this coalition of the willing throwing money and support at Zelensky to keep on fighting, to fight to the last Ukrainian. They're happy to see that. But also to build up Europe's militaries. The amount of money that the Europeans are spending now, wasting on their militaries at a time when their economies are hurting, their people are hurting, to me is tragic. So I see no winners coming out of this, and and I almost see no good guys in this situation. I see the bad and I see the worst, and so I think that for humanity overall, it's a tragic occurrence, and so that's the background to this meeting that occurred last Friday in Istanbul. As I said in one of my opening line in something I wrote, Ria Novosti interviewed me, and I said, while it would not be quite accurate to dismiss Friday's Turkey meeting as Istanbul shit, and I wrote, try translating that one, Andre. All sober analysts knew that the chances for any meaningful progress in peace negotiations were slim at best. The meeting didn't fail to live down to those expectations. So nothing was accomplished. In some ways, I think Putin was massaging Donald Trump's fragile ego. That Donald Trump wants to be thought of as a peacemaker, that desperately wants a Nobel Peace Prize. He says, well, Obama got a Nobel Peace Prize. Why shouldn't I get a Nobel Peace Prize? And, the bizarre thing is that around the world, in some ways, he's been more a force for good than a force for destruction. I mean, he says that he'd much rather negotiate with Iran than bomb it back to the Stone Age. Well, that makes sense. He stopped the bombing of the Houthis in Yemen. He certainly hasn't done anything yet to ease tensions with China. He has not done what he could to try to curb Netanyahu and the horrible things that the Israelis are doing in Gaza. But so I say on balance, his record is somewhat mixed. But when it comes to his repeated statement that this is a bloodbath, that it has to come to an end sooner rather than later, that he was going to end it on day one in office, but that was silly. But at least he's been pushing for diplomacy. While during the Biden years, diplomacy became a four-letter word. Diplomacy was a dirty word in the Biden lexicon. At least Trump, to his credit, has tried to restore a peace process, and but so far, I'm waiting to see the printout from this phone call. I checked about a minute before we started, and it hadn't been released yet.
Peter, I wonder uh, what your thoughts are on Trump wanting to be a mediator in this conflict when everybody here knows that the United States is really the principal adversary against Russia. And now Trump seems to be owning this conflict by continuing to send money and weapons, apparently, to Ukraine. At least that's what I've read. And on the other hand, he says, "Well, I want you guys to stop fighting and negotiate." How do you see that, Peter?
I see Trump as a self-contradictory person uh, who's on all sides of most issues. Uh, I don't think Trump has got a fixed worldview. I don't think he's got firmly rooted values. When people describe Trump as being transactional, that seems to be what he's really about. He doesn't embrace the idea of American exceptionalism, really. America first is very different than American exceptionalism. The idea behind American exceptionalism that's been embraced pretty much by every other president, certainly the 20th and 21st centuries, is that the United States is not only different from all other countries, that the United States is better than all other countries, because the United States, unlike everybody else, is motivated by a desire to spread freedom and democracy and do good in the world. where everybody else is motivated by wanting territory or geopolitical power or wealth. The United States stands on principle. Well, Trump has ended that. Trump doesn't have any principles that he stands on other than business, really. Uh, his inclinations to me are fascistic in terms of the world that he'd like to create and what he's doing in the United States. However, globally, for some reason, he wants to achieve global fascism, I think, peacefully rather than by bombing the world back into compliance with what America wants. So I like that and that we've seen this bizarre reversal in recent years. But take us back to the early 21st century in the George W. Bush administration and the Project for a New American Century and the neocons who populated that administration. And they had this messianic vision of the United States toppling all these governments, one after another. The people at the Pentagon were saying seven governments, and they've, to some extent, tried to do that. And uh, then, but now those neocons seem to have migrated to the Democratic Party, and many of them don't like Trump. Trump's view is more isolationist, more America first. And what is America first? Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said recently, "When I hear America first, it reminds me of Deutschland über alles." And there is that element to what Trump represents, but he seems to have a sincere aversion to war. And maybe that's because he doesn't want to mess up his beautiful golf courses and his beautiful hotels and buildings with his name on it. I'm not sure, but you can trace his anti-war views back decades. At the same time, he's a very violent individual. And he says could use force to take back the Panama Canal, to take Greenland, bombing the Houthis, threatening Syria in the past. So he's got this violent side to him, but he also seems to want to get what he wants without warfare, which I think is good in the nuclear age. And so when I see Trump, I don't trust him. And I went to Russia. I was just there for my ninth visit. And I hadn't been back since before COVID. The last time I was there was January 2019. And during the campaign, Trump's 2016 campaign, I was there quite a few times. And I was often the only one at a conference who would support Hillary Clinton. I would say, I can't stand Hillary Clinton. I disagree with her on everything. But from the Russian self-interest standpoint, that Hillary Clinton would be better for Russia than Donald Trump. That the idea of somebody so rash, impulsive, unpredictable, in charge of the nuclear arsenal is a step too far. And what did Trump do? Obama said that Ukraine is much more in Russia's national security interest than America's, and he refused to give lethal aid to Ukraine. Who started giving lethal aid? Trump. Who doubled down on the sanctions? Trump. Who pulled the United States out of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, the INF treaty, the Open Skies treaty? Trump. Who refused to extend the New START treaty, the last treaty is, preventing a full-scale nuclear arms race? Again, it was Trump. So I don't see Trump as in any way representing any kind of utopian panaceic figure. And when I said in this latest thing I wrote for Rio Novasti, that that Russia would be smart to look to the Xi Jinping, to look to Lula, to look to Pope Leo, to look to Guterres, as the mediators, not just the United States. If the U.S. wants to play a positive role, good. But don't fall for this idea that Trump is your friend, because Trump can turn on you on a dime and give more lethal aid to Ukraine again, give more financial aid. And he's threatened to do so. He said if Russia doesn't play ball along the lines that he wants, he's going to consider giving more aid to Ukraine. And we know that he's capable of that because he doesn't really have strong values and beliefs. He wants to achieve what he wants to achieve, which at this point is to be thought of as a peacemaker and win the Nobel Peace Prize. I'm sorry to keep going, but I'm the one who nominated the current Nobel Peace Prize winners, Neo Nadanko, for the Nobel Peace Prize. Uh, Neo Nadanko is the atomic bomb survivors group in Japan, and they finally won. I've been nominating them for years, and they invited me to Oslo as part of their delegation as a result of that. And they represent something very, very positive. And so I understand a little bit about the Nobel Peace Prize, and I understand why Trump would like to receive it. It would be a certain kind of validation of who he is, and he needs a lot of external validation. I think he's got a very fragile ego. Um, but and I've even said at times, if he ends the war in Ukraine, uh, and gets Israel to stop devastating Gaza, and gets a peace deal with Iran, and ends the nuclear arms race, I'll begrudgingly nominate him. But so far he hasn't been able to deliver on very much of that. But his instincts are in some ways positive, so I'm not saying that it's not possible.
I want to go back to the situation in Ukraine and in Russia's position. From where I sit and reading what various Russian high-level people say, including Putin and Lavrov, members of the Duma, that the United States is adverse to agreement, non-agreement capable. I think Russia has made it clear that that's what they believe and a principle that they're acting on. And you can see that Putin has said, we're moving east. We've been moving east to a different kind of world, a multipolar world. Um, and, you know, we really don't need anything from the United States or from Europe. Now, I'd like your comment on that, but I also want you to comment on what many people here, and I say there are people in the Duma, as you probably know, and there are Russian so-called experts and bloggers who believe that Russia, in order to end this, has got to go all the way to Odessa and Kiev, clean out that fascist ideology and government, and start over. Your thoughts on those two things, Peter?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I agree with the first and don't disagree with the second. I think that Russia is changing its orientation. The alliance that the Russians have with China is a game changer. Where Nixon was capable of dividing Russia from China with his diplomacy. In some ways, the Biden diplomacy has put Russia and China into bed together, and their friendship is tighter than ever. Their alliance is closer than ever. And it's not just China. Part of the reasons why the sanctions have been such a failure so far, the West thought that it could destroy Russia's economy. It didn't happen. Russia is doing better economically than most of the Europeans are. And that's because the global South has has not gone along. And why not? I don't usually quote the London Economist, but they did say one thing that I liked. They said to Biden and the US, this is a fight between autocracy and democracy. To the rest of the world, it's a fight between autocracy and hypocrisy. Why? How does the United States have the forbearance, the chutzpah to say that, you know, that Russia is so evil in what it's doing when the United States has been invading country after country for decades. You know, the war of my generation is the Vietnam War. And I was back in Vietnam a little more than a year ago. And in Hanoi, I met with the Vietnamese leaders. And the number that I've always used for how many Vietnamese died in the war was what Robert McNamara, former Secretary of Defense and architect of that war, told my students a few years ago. And he said he accepts that 3.8 million Vietnamese died in the war, which to me was mind-boggling. Uh, but when I was in Hanoi, the number that the leaders told me, Vietnamese leaders told me that they now use is that 5 million Vietnamese died in the war. How can the country, that led to 5 million Vietnamese deaths, try to pose itself as a moral force for peace and freedom and democracy? I mean, it's absurd to me. And I see the global South saying they don't want to be part of the U.S. camp, and they don't want to, they want to be involved in a pro-development and in peaceful resolution of conflicts, which is not represented. You know what Trump has said correctly is that this is a proxy war between the United States and Russia. And for the most part, the global South has not wanted to become caught up in it in that way. And or India, Modi is not my favorite leader, but I do an enormous amount of Indian TV. I've done 3 speaking tours in India in recent years, and I give a lot of talks there. And but India has steered also a bipartisan path or a nonpartisan path. And that's been part of the strength of India and why it's been able to grow as rapidly as it has. And is very dependent on Russia for its military and its arms and defense, and also has close ties with the West. But I think most of the world is looking that way. But the groups that we're seeing, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and especially the BRICS, represent a kind of a much more positive approach right now, because the dollar and the dollar dependent countries, the ones most closely aligned, meaning the Europeans and NATO countries, are very much uh, have become warmongers. And I look at this coalition of the willing, Merz, Starmer, Macron, Tusk, Callas, and I see them as being willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. Why are they so opposed to a peaceful resolution? Do they really believe that Russia, which is struggling so mightily to subdue Ukraine, is going to now start a war with NATO? Are they insane? It doesn't make the least bit of logical sense to me. But they build up this fear in their populations so they can push through, for a while, Trump was criticizing the NATO countries for not spending 2% of their GDP on their militaries. Then they're spending 4%. Then Trump says he wants them to spend 5%. And then some of them saying they want to spend more than 5%. Eisenhower made that great speech on March 5th, 1953. Stalin died, and we had an opportunity to end the Cold War there. Malenkov and Khrushchev and the other Russian leaders held out an olive branch to the West, effectively to settle and end the Cold War. And Eisenhower didn't say anything for weeks. And then he made one of the 2 best speeches of his presidency. And he said that every dollar that's spent on fighter planes, on bombs, on troops is a theft from what people need, from the new schools that people need, the new roads, the hospitals, the housing. He's called it a theft. And that was right. And and then Dulles, of course, comes out and contradicts it, and the Cold War is off and running again. But that's the reality now. And the Chinese, with the Belt and Road Initiative, have gone outside the bounds of the IMF and the World Bank. And I'm not saying it's perfect by any means, but at least the underlying principle is the one that we need right now in order to create a just and peaceful world, and a more prosperous world. But so in terms of your first question, I very much agree with you that Russia's orientation away from Europe and the United States makes some sense. But what I would like to see is the war end and Russia be reintegrated into the global economy as a positive force. I want to see the United States play a positive role. I want to see the Europeans play a positive role and not be spending all this money. And I don't want to see diplomacy be restored as the highest good. You look at the United States, the amount of money that's come out of the State Department and gone into the military, gone into the Pentagon. We up till 1947, we had a little bit of honesty, and we didn't call it the Defense Department. We called it the War Department, and we didn't have a Secretary of Defense. We had a Secretary of War, and that's really what it's about, and has been, and still is. Uh, but now with Orwellian doublespeak, we can change the words for this. War becomes peace, and defense. War becomes defense. Well, that's not the reality. But the other point you make that I'm among those who thinks that the Russian attack on Ukraine as being neo-Nazis is vastly exaggerated. Is there a neo-Nazi element in Ukraine? Absolutely. Do they date back to the World War II neo-Nazis who I totally hate? Yes. They do. And has they been gaining more of a foothold and tearing down statues and raising up the neo-Nazis across parts of Ukraine? Yes. And it goes way beyond the Azov battalion. So I think that is a problem. But I see these neo-Nazis everywhere. I see them in the United States. I see them across Europe, in Germany, in Poland. You know, so uh, so whereas I lost most of my family in the Holocaust before I was born. I have no sympathy for fascists, for neo-fascists, for neo-Nazis anywhere. I think they're the scourge and have to be wiped out or marginalized, whichever way we can do it. But I think that focusing on that is to play into Russian propaganda. I think all countries are propagandizing, and I see the way all countries, especially the United States, but other countries too, can actually mobilize history, false history, in the interests of, of reinforcing their own national myths rather than coming to a broader understanding. And so I was just in Moscow. I was there to chair the documentary jury for the Moscow International Film Festival. And the Russians I spoke to, and I spoke to, lots and lots and lots, uh, they are either they're opposed to the invasion of Ukraine on principle, or they're exhausted by the war, and they want to see it come to an end as quickly as possible. They all think it was provoked. They all think that NATO expansion was the root of it. They almost all think that the support for Putin is over 80%. I think, even the people who I spoke to who are desperate to see this war end, and including people who have left Russia, young Russians who have left the country, Putin, they approve of Putin. And so when I see this demonization of Putin, this Russophobia in the West, I think it's so distorted and dangerous. And I say that, the world, to me, the worst thing that's happened since World War II is the U.S. invasion of Vietnam and the consequence of that. Did the world try to demonize the United States? Was the United States excluded from the world economy, from global banking, from global peacemaking after Vietnam? No. The Vietnam syndrome, the U.S., if anything, tried to whitewash its Vietnam involvement and had the support of other countries in doing so. And so this attempt to now exclude Russia from all deliberations, from the throwing them out of the G8 and everything else that's gone on, to me represents such a hypocrisy. So I don't like the war. I don't support the invasion of Ukraine. In the nuclear age, for me, the bar for invading another country is so high that you put up with a lot of the crap that Russia had to put up with NATO expansion and try to find some other way to resolve it. So I don't think it was an existential threat, but I understand why it was a threat. And I understand that Russia had been warning about it being a threat for more than a decade before the invasion. I understand how strongly Putin felt about it. Even Yeltsin, everybody felt that this was an outrage, what the NATO expansion. And they did promise Gorbachev in 1990 that NATO would not expand 1 inch, one thumb's width to the east. And they never got it in writing. Gorbachev made the mistake of trusting them, but it was even before 1990 was out that beginning discussions were taking place in NATO about expanding to the east. And so it didn't begin officially till 1998 with Hungary and Poland and Czechoslovakia, but they were planning it earlier, and then it went on from there. So I understand and I sympathize with the Russian position, and I see the way so many American statesmen you know, uh, opposed NATO expansion and understood that this was going to provoke Russia into not only hostility, but even military response. So, I mean, I put the blame very much. And there were these ways out. There was Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. And then after the fighting started, we've all been talking now about the original Istanbul Accords. And it's important to me that they had initialed it. There were still issues to resolve, but we were on the road to ending that a month after the invasion started. And then you got Boris Johnson coming there and telling Zelensky, don't sign this agreement. We're going to give you all the aid and arms that you need. And the support is going to be unending. And so what Putin did with the recent Turkey Istanbul negotiations is the man he chose to head up the negotiating team was Medinsky, who was the one who was carrying out the original Turkish Accords back in 2022, because he's seeing this as a continuation. So I think that was true. The Zelensky and everybody kept saying it was such a low level delegation that showed that that it was a sham, that the Russians weren't serious about it. Well, it wasn't that low level. I think could honestly say it was a mid-level delegation. But I think that Putin sees that in some ways it's in Russia's interest at this point to keep fighting it out on the battlefield because Russia is on the offensive. But you look at how long it's taken them to take Pokrovsk, which many of us thought they were going to take months ago. So I hate to see this, and I'm afraid, Regis, that what we're going to see is that we're going to be back at the negotiating table a few months from now, and there'll be tens of thousands more Russians and Ukrainians dead. Russia will have a better position. They'll have a little bit more of Ukraine that they occupy, and Ukraine will be in a worse position, and the world will be in a worse position. And we don't know with Trump in there. We know that under Biden, when Biden started giving the advanced weapon systems to Ukraine, even before the ATACMS, even the earlier ones, the CIA said if the U.S. continues this, there's a 50-50 chance that's going to lead to nuclear war. And then Biden gives them Ukrainians permission to use the ATACMS to attack deep inside of Russia. And the world was terrified at that point that nuclear war was going to be imminent. And Russia went ahead and changed its nuclear doctrine. And it did its Oreshnik missile attack inside Ukraine. And these Oreshniks are frightening. H.R. McMaster, the former U.S. National Security Advisor, said that the United States won't come up with a missile defense system that can stop these Oreshnik missiles for another 15 years, as McMaster said. So the longer we go on, we see this war. It's a drone war, it's a robotic war, it's an AI war, and it's because the face of warfare is becoming so much more frightening at this point. And what we also see, so Russia changed its nuclear doctrine to lower the threshold for use of nuclear weapons and to say that they can use these nuclear weapons not only against a nation attacking Russia, but any nuclear armed nation that's supporting this attack on Russia is also a legitimate target for Russia's mili- uh, nuclear attack. So the world is so much more dangerous now than it's been since 1962, if not ever. And so it's why we need to end the war. We need to go start really embracing diplomacy, and the US and Russia have got to be in the forefront of that.
So, Peter, one last question on this topic before I move on to the untold history of the United States. Um, you talk about this war has to end, and a lot of people are talking about that. How do you see it ending?
I, what I'd like to see is Putin say to Trump in this phone call today, "You're right. This is a bloodbath, and we're hurting our own youth, and we're hurting Ukrainian youth, and Russia and Ukraine. You know, all my Russian friends have family and friends in Ukraine. All my Ukrainian friends have family and friends in Russia. They couldn't believe that these two countries were at war in the way that they have been. So these bonds are very, very deep. And uh, I would love, yes, I wish it would end tomorrow. But I think that Ukraine has got to be a lot more realistic. They are not going to get back Crimea. They're not going to get back the four oblasts that Putin has claimed. I think where there's negotiating room, okay, so Ukraine is not going to make that legal. They're going to just say this is de facto, not de jure. And I think Putin can say, we'll end the fighting at the line where we're at now and not demand that Ukraine withdraw from the entirety of the four regions that are now part of the Russian constitution. Okay, so that's a compromise on Putin's part to accept the status quo as it sits now. Uh, then the question becomes, the denazification, leave that up to Ukrainians, and hopefully Ukrainians will figure that one out. Demilitarization, I can't see Ukraine really accepting that, but I can see a very different kind of security structure and security guarantees. Russia is not going to accept NATO or the coalition of the willing in Ukraine. That's a non-starter. Forget it. They're not going to accept these warmongers there on their border. Uh, what they would accept, though, is an international peacekeeping force, and that would include China and Brazil and the UN and maybe third world countries who are not out to destroy and weaken Russia. And so I could see that as a basis. I think I could understand from Ukraine's position why they want more security guarantees, why they're afraid that if this ends, then Russia will be back in 5 years, uh, especially because there's such a risk of Ukrainian provocations. Part of the reason why, to get back to your other point before about Russia needing to take Odessa and Kyiv, uh, Russia would be fighting a prolonged guerrilla war there that nobody would want to be involved in. I think Russia wants and needs peace and stability in Ukraine and potentially at some point friendly relations. The US and Vietnam have friendly relations now. And look what the US did to the Vietnamese. And so Russia and Ukraine hopefully will again restore friendly relations. But now Zelensky's in a very difficult position because if he gives in to what looks like a capitulation to Russia, he's going to be out. I mean, there are strong nationalist right-wing forces in Ukraine who would lynch or, you know, evict Zelensky. And so he's going to need some place to go that's going to be safer. And the Ukrainian people are going to have to, this are going to need to be elections again quickly. Uh, and, but I can see this being resolved partly out of Ukrainian weakness. I mean, the reality is that they're going to be in a worse position a month from now, 6 months from now, a year from now. And so it's not a question of capitulation, it's a question of accepting reality. And I think Putin can also show some flexibility. The Chinese like to talk about win-win diplomacy. Maybe Putin can figure out a way to make it look like this is, if not a win for Ukraine, at least not a humiliating defeat. And the Ukrainians have fought bravely. I mean, I expected them to collapse immediately. It didn't happen. They could claim some measure of victory uh, and place the blame where it should be on the Europeans and the Americans who've egged them on, for their own selfish reasons rather than in Ukraine's interests. So has Zelensky been wise? No. Has he been brave? Yes. Uh, and he's got a lot of global support. So maybe there's a way to resolve this in more of a win-win fashion and do it quickly rather than the nightmare scenario of being back again in a worse situation with so many more dead.
Peter, I want to thank you for that really very brilliant and clear analysis. I want to leave that topic now, and I want to come back to something that for me has been life transforming. It's the book that you and Oliver co-authored, The Untold History of the United States. Um, I've read it. Then I got a DVD series, and I've watched that over and over and over again. Um, I want to ask you, how did that book come about? Uh, I know a little bit of that background, but I would like to share that with the people who are viewing this, and hopefully, if they don't know about it and haven't purchased the book or seen it on Showtime, will do everything they can to see it because this book will change the way they see their country and the world.
And it was on Russia One. And when I was just in Russia with all these filmmakers, they told me that usually when Russia One puts on these historic documentaries, it's at 2 in the morning. Well, this was the first one they said that was in prime time in Russia. And so it got tremendous viewership. The book is sold extremely well. My Russian copy is behind me.
I can
But
see it.
and since then, in 2019, Oliver and I put out a second edition, which carries the story up to 2019. And in Russia, as in other countries, they put out a big expanded version of the whole thing, and they also put out the update as a standalone book. So uh, so in 2007, 2008, Oliver was in town filming or scouting locations for his movie about the My Lai massacre, Pinkville. He was going to be here for a day, so he called me and asked me if I could join him for dinner. So we went out to dinner that night. We were with his producer, John Killick, his cinematographer, Bob Richardson. Both of them are great. And we start talking about history and politics, as we always do. And in the middle of it, Oliver says, Peter, let's do it. Let's do a documentary. Okay, we hadn't decided what the topic was, but of course, you don't say no to Oliver Stone if you're a historian when he wants to do a documentary with you. Then I went to see him in New York 2 weeks later to map it out. And now he's got this idea for a 10-hour, 10-part documentary film series. And we ended up doing 12 hours. 10 hours we showed on Showtime, but the box set has got all 12. And then so I write I'd never written a documentary before, so I would write them, and each of mine would be assuming he was going to narrate them like a New Yorker on speed and go so fast and get in all this material. But each of my first drafts would have required at least 3 hours. And so we'd go back and forth and narrow it down. What I realized was that there was so much that we were leaving out that was crucial. So I pitched Oliver on the need to do the book. And, he was at least initially resistant because he didn't want to slow down the process of doing the documentary. But he finally was open to it. And we pitched it to publishers. And we were pitching a Ken Burns type, um, coffee table book. And they said, no, we want a serious book, which was, music to my ears. So we put together a research team. 8 of my PhD students were on it, on the payroll. And we began doing the research in much greater depth. They were also involved in the research for the documentary. And so the whole process of doing the documentaries and the book took 5 years. And the book came out, and it was a New York Times bestseller for, I think, 7 weeks, and bestseller on 3 continents. And, and the documentaries hit at the same time. And to me, it was frustrating because I thought what we were saying was so compelling, so powerful that it was going to change the world, that it was going to open people's eyes. And we were going to get off this path of war and domination and, empire and create a peaceful world. And of course, that's not the way the world works. And I saw how the propaganda machine mobilized against us. Whereas I would say 85% of the reviews were effusive, very, very positive, glowing. In the key places that are the spokespersons, the mouthpieces for the establishment, for the status quo, for American empire, they went after us viciously, savagely, dishonestly. The New York Times, the New York Review of Books, those sources were, I think, so, the New York Review of Books, who'd they give it to? uh, they gave it to somebody who had already attacked us in the New York Times. So the New York Times, the main critic of what we did was this guy, Ron Radosh. And Ron Radosh had been a leftist in his youth. His parents were Bolsheviks, and then he became an extreme right winger. And he started to attack us. But then when the New York Times contacted him, he said, well, I don't have a lot of credibility, with the mainstream. So he suggested this Princeton professor, uh, who also had contacted him to support him, And so the New York Times quotes him and says, Kuznick and Stone are off in La La Land. This is crazy stuff. Uh, so that's the headline at the time. And so then who does the New York Review of Books get to review it? This same Princeton professor who's already on record saying the opposite of what all the historians, what Gorbachev and our Russian friends have said. Uh, and so, just to try to discredit us, to take away our credibility. So we wrote a serious scholarly book. which Oliver was fine with, with 100 pages of footnotes, because I knew Oliver had this reputation after JFK, that brilliant movie, which led to the Assassination Records Review Board and, to this whole discussion and debate in the U.S. I knew that he would get attacked or we would get attacked for being conspiracy mongers. So we avoided conspiracy. It's straight history. And we gave so many footnotes because we knew that there'd be legions, armies of people just waiting for us to screw up. And so we were so careful and meticulous, and they didn't challenge us on our facts, and they didn't accuse us of being conspiracy mongers, and they didn't accuse us of being anti-Israel. So because it was a very, very positive scholarly work. Um, but they still managed to weave their ways to discredit us in certain circles, certain establishment circles, where we would otherwise have, started this really, really serious debate. But they were able to try to they never dismissed us. We got tens of thousands, scores of millions of readers, viewers, endorsers, and we still get contacted all the time by people who, say that they just discovered it and it changed their view of history. I want to talk to Oliver now about doing a new edition because the world has changed so much since 2019 to now that we've got to help put this in context and perspective and make sense out of it because we're still what Oliver and I did was view history in the world from the standpoint of the planet, not from making America great again, making Russia great again, making China great again, making India great. We said, how do we make the human species great? How do we look at all of this from the standpoint of the human species, a planetary approach, a global approach? Why should we divide ourselves? What's the difference between Americans and Russians? I go to Russia and I love the people there. I love their art. I love their culture. I love their music. I love their vodka. I love their interactions, their sense of humor. And I go to Vietnam and I go around the world. And, the things that divide us are so much less than the things that unite us. So why do we have this parochial, balkanized, you know, nationalistic view of things? We should really look at all of this from a planetary perspective. How do we save this planet? Which is, clearly, as Guterres says, burning up. How do we look at global health? We live in a world in which the richest 6 people have more wealth than the poorest 4 billion people. What kind of crazy world allows 3 or 6 people to have more wealth than half the people on the planet? You know, how do we begin to resolve these things? There's huge gaps between rich and poor, healthy and unhealthy, people with water and healthcare and people without. This is what we need to be doing. And if Trump wants to do that, I would love to see that. Or Putin. I would love to see Putin call for a global summit to walk us back off the ledge. Or Guterres, or the Pope, or Xi Jinping. We need to be sitting down and figuring these things out rationally in everybody's interest. I know that's idealistic, that's pie in the sky, it's utopian, it's naive, but I don't know why we can't do that.
Well, actually, I don't think it's utopian. I think it's very pragmatic because if we don't do it, we're finished. Uh,
So
I'm
yeah,
not I'm not very hopeful uh, about the future of this planet for a couple of reasons. Number one, you've talked about it. It's the threat and the imminent threat of nuclear war. I think most people who understand these things will realize how close we really are.
yeah.
Um, I made a film. It was called 30 Seconds to Midnight.
Oh,
If I were to issue that film today, I would be calling it The Final Countdown,
yeah,
5, 4, 3. The
yeah,
other thing, Peter, that concerns me greatly, and I think the powers that be have used climate change to push an agenda and to frighten people. I refuse to talk about climate change, and I don't know if you'd agree with me, but I've traveled around the world, not as much as you have, but what I have seen is environmental degradation and destruction everywhere I've been. I've seen the destruction that happens because of industrial pollution, because of our our consumerism, because of debt, because of our economic system. I've seen the results of war on the ground. You can talk about millions dead, but what has it done to the environment, to our planet? And I think it's our planet that really is at risk, and all of us who live on it. The planet will survive. We may not. In fact, I think we very well could be approaching the sixth mass extinction when you look at how many species are going extinct every day and every year because of not climate change, not global warming, because the environment that they've lived in and thrived in has been destroyed. Deforestation, pollution of rivers, oceans. Uh, anyway, I think your thoughts are not utopian; they're mine as well, and I think it's pragmatic,
Well,
urgently pragmatic that we find a way, as you said, to get these key people together to begin talking about how we save ourselves.
when you talk about planetary extinction, I'm looking in on the screen and I see my one of my snakes behind me in the terrarium crawling around back there. It's a beautiful California king snake. In the terrarium behind that, I've got a very, very beautiful yellow python. And, um, and the destruction of the habitats greatly, greatly disturbs me and it horrifies me. And but I would add global warming to all the things you said because but that's another issue. We're both concerned about the bigger picture. But you raised the nuclear question, which we've hardly gone into. It is insanity, and a year ago, January, the hands of the doomsday clock were at 90 seconds before midnight. And then this past January, the bullet and atomic scientists experts moved the hands to 89 seconds before midnight. And I was recently at a conference with John Mecklin, who's the editor-in-chief of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And I asked him, why did you only move the hands 1 second? And his response was, first, he said, well, they wanted to move to 88, but that's the global signal for Heil Hitler. So he didn't want to move it to 88. And I said, but why not to 80? Or I would have moved it to 60 seconds before midnight. And he said there were people on the board of experts who did want to do that, who did agree with that. But there were others who were much more resistant. And I've been on some shows with another member of the experts who I think was totally out to lunch, in terms of viewing the threats. But what I see, when Biden gave the permission for Ukraine to use the attack guns to strike deep inside of Russia, I thought that, wow, this is because Biden had himself warned against doing this earlier, and the thinking is, okay, so first we gave this system, we gave that system. Every time Ukraine asked for a new weapon system, Biden said no. He said it's too provocative. We don't want World War III with Russia. And 2 months later, he ends up giving it to them. He caved into the pressure every time. We don't know if there was anybody home with Biden or not. But then the people around him were hawks. The Sullivans and the Blinkens and others were very, very hawkish. Biden came to office with 18 top advisors from the Center for New American Security. Those were mostly China hawks, but they were all hawks. And there were a lot of Russia hawks as well. And so they were so dangerous. And then uh, but I look at what's going on then. So Trump says that we need to cut the nuclear arsenals. That was great. I like that he said that. He said we have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world 10 or 100 times over. Okay, metaphorically, that's correct. So I didn't mind the inexactitude of what he said. But then I look what's going on, and I see that all nine nuclear powers are modernizing their nuclear arsenals, that almost all of them, so in modernizing means modernizing the delivery systems and the weapons themselves in two ways. One is to make some of them smaller so that they're more usable, and the other is to make them more lethal, more potent, more deadly. And so I see them all modernizing, and I see almost all of them expanding. If you look at that Project 2025 report that Trump said he never read, but clearly was written by all of his people, and he's enacting. Uh, when it comes to the nuclear, it calls for expanding America's nuclear arsenal. And we see that Britain is increasing their Trident submarines and weapons 40%. We see China, I don't know if the Pentagon is right, but China had about 200 nuclear weapons, which I thought was a sufficient deterrent. Now they've got about 500. They want to have at least 1,000 nuclear weapons by 2030 and 1,500 by 2035. So right now there are two people, Trump and Putin, who've got veto power over the future existence of life on our planet, and Xi Jinping wants to join that group. Well, so but we looked at where they're all talking about expanding or in the process of expanding. Over the years, in 1985, 86, we had about 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world. I took my students for 25 years a study abroad class in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I used to find myself at the Hiroshima Atomic Bomb Museum writing down the same information year after year because it was just so stunning to me. It said that by 1985, the world had accumulated the equivalent of 1.47 million Hiroshima bombs. How insane have we become as a species? But we managed to lower that. We've gone down from 70,000 to less than 14,000, and now we're building it up again. And if we don't, so Trump pulled the US, Trump didn't pull the US out. Trump refused to extend the New START treaty, and Biden, to his credit, extended it, and now it goes to February 2026, which is almost here. So we desperately need new arms control agreements. But you go beyond that and you look at what Starmer and Macron have been saying. They've been offering to extend their European nuclear umbrella to Germany and Austria and Poland and other countries. The Poles say they want their own nuclear weapons. Zelensky says he wants Ukraine to have its own nuclear weapons. South Korea, 73% of the public in South Korea want South Korea to have its own nuclear weapons. Japan, Ishiba, Japan, the most anti-nuclear country in the world for most of the post-war period, for obvious reasons. Ishiba, before he takes office as prime minister, says he not only wants an Asian NATO, he wants Japan to have its own nuclear weapons also. He hasn't said it since he got into office a few months ago, but this is the way the Japanese are thinking. And you look at how much plutonium, enriched plutonium they have, enough for dozens of bombs. Iran, if the US, Israel, Netanyahu wants to bomb their nuclear facilities in Iran. If they did that, number one, they probably couldn't destroy them at Fort Dow and Iraq and the others. But what would Iran do? It would immediately rush to develop a nuclear weapon. And under the old JCPOA, Iran was not allowed to and was not enriching uranium beyond 3.67%. Now, after Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, which was working brilliantly, now Iran is enriching to 60%. To get from 3.67 to 60% is hard. To get from 60% to 90%, which is what's needed for a weapon, is easy. And so, and if Iran developed nuclear weapons to protect itself against Israel, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Turkey are all going to develop nuclear weapons overnight. So what I'm afraid of is we're on the verge of nuclear anarchy in the world now. That the opposite direction of where we were going for decades. So for me, it's very frightening. And whereas you look at, so Iran could blow up at any point. But the Trump people keep saying, and Wickoff and Trump saying, red line, we're not going to let Ukraine enrich uranium. I mean, let Iran enrich uranium. The Iranians saying it's a red line for them. They insist upon having an enrichment capability. And so, all these things can unravel and unravel quickly and create the nightmare scenario we've all been warning about and fearing. When Oliver, during his lengthy interviews with Putin, Oliver spent 20 hours with Vladimir Putin. And during that time, he asked Putin if he'd ever seen the movie Dr. Strangelove. And Putin said no. Oliver took out his computer and they sat down and watched it together on Oliver's computer. And in some ways, the Strangelove scenario, which General Jack the Ripper, because of his, you know, loss of energy after having an orgasm, is convinced that the Soviets are polluting America's water supply and purifying our vital fluids. Launches an attack on Russia. I mean, it's got a bizarre pretext. But another movie that came out the same year, based on the same book, Red Alert by Peter George, but came out 6 months later because of the fight over plagiarism and rights to the story, was called Failsafe, which is the same movie treated not as a black comedy, but seriously. And that in that case, it's a technological failure that leads to the unfortunate, unprovoked U.S. nuclear attack on Moscow. And so I'm saying that when Oliver and Ray McGovern were there recently, they should show Putin failsafe this time, because in some ways it's more relevant to the situation that we're facing now. So I think we're as you're saying, as a planet, we're at a very, very dangerous moment, and our existence is fragile. And you talk about the sixth extinction. We can stop it. The point is we're here. We're talking about it. We're meeting. And as Kennedy said, that we're not helpless. We created this situation. We are capable of uncreating it, of marching it back, walking it back. And we just need the leaders with the vision and the people with the strength to force their leaders to do that. And it's not inevitable, the end of life on our planet, but it's also very, very possible at this point.
Peter, I want to thank you for all that you've been doing all over the world to make this a healthier planet, a more peaceful planet, to avoid war. And I can't thank you enough for taking the time to come on the show with me tonight. Thank you so much.
Regis, it's always great to talk to you. Thank you, and keep up your efforts too. We need all of us in this fight.